So hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening for those folks who join us from Tehran or London. And thank you for joining us virtually for a conversation with Professor Wilkinson about 6 decades of US sanctions against Cuba. My name is Nilufar Adnani, and I am a PhD student in International Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I join you from Arlington, Virginia, and I acknowledge my presence on traditional homelands of Native peoples who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. I have the pleasure of being with you on behalf of the Sanctions Studies Collective, a transnational initiative by a group of Iranian students. We have organized a series of seminars on methodological and theoretical challenges of the study of economic sanctions. Hereby, I invite you all to follow us on different social media platforms to be notified about and hopefully join our upcoming sessions. Did I drop the Twitter link now in the chat box? Okay, and before the start of the conversation, I want you also to remind that we will leave some times for Q&A at the end of the session, and you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen for dropping your questions. Also, the entire session will be recorded and posted online in case you had any connectivity issue or time conflict and want to watch the session later. Today, I am delighted to welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stephen Wilkinson, lecturer in politics and international relations and chairperson of the Humanities School Teaching and Learning Committee at Buckingham University. Professor Wilkinson is considered as one of the UK's leading experts on Cuba and US-Cuba relations. He has been traveling to and writing about the island since 1987. He is the chairman of the International Institute for the Study of Cuba and the editor of the International Journal of the Cuban Studies. He writes frequently on the history of European and US-Cuba relations and the nature of the Cuban state. So since the beginning of the 20th century, economic sanctions have been used as one of the primary policy tools by different states and international entities, including the League of Nations and later the United Nations Security Council, the United Kingdom, United States, European Union, and more recently, other large economies such as China. In 2021, the US comprehensive plans of economic sanctions, including restrictions on imports, exports, financial transactions, and travel, have continued to be imposed against about 140 million people in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Crimea region of Ukraine, roughly accounting for about 2% of the world's population. But what are these sanctions plans exactly? And how do they work? More specifically, when it comes to Cuba, majority of scholars argue that one of the longest plans of economic sanctions has not worked, or even further, they argue it has failed. Yet, sanctions objective and outcomes are rarely conceptually well-defined and examined. In other words, there seem to be limited shared objectives when it comes to examining sanctions between sanctioner policymakers and academics. If US sanctions against Cuba has not worked, why are they still in place? And in the current global neoliberal economic order driven by the US and other states, especially Western states, for decades, where do economic sanctions stand as a global force? To get to understand some of the embedded complexities regarding the study of economic sanctions, without further ado, I am in honor to invite Dr. Wilkinson for his speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a nice introduction, and it was absolutely on point about the nature of sanctions and whether or not they work and why they are very so often perceived as being failures and yet persist as policies. And of course, in the case of Cuba, that's the point of this whole paper. Let me share my screen and see if I can get the slides up. There they are. You can all see those, I hope, yeah?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So the first thing to say is that if you look at the discourse around the sanctions policy on Cuba, the so-called embargo, and I think the first point to make about the sanctions policy towards Cuba is that it's very often referred to as a singular, the embargo, when in fact it is a massive array of different policies and acts and presidential orders and applications of US law to Cuba. It's a massive mixture of different sanctions that have been applied differently at different times. It's not just one policy, and it's also a mixture of actions that have been taken by different areas or different sectors of the US government itself. So in some cases, it has been presidential orders and presidential actions, and at other stages, it's been actions by US Congress which have been applied. So it's an extremely complex creature. And it's very often, I think, a mistake to refer to it just as one policy. So it changes over time in terms of its severity and reach. For example, we're talking at the moment on Zoom, and I think there's a colleague, I know that Reza is actually in Iran. So Zoom can be used in Iran. It can't be used in Cuba because it's subject to a sanction. If you were to have this kind of conference with Cuba, you'd have to use the open access software Jitsi, because neither Teams nor Zoom can be used in Cuba. So its reach is actually really, at the moment, the greatest extent that it has been for very, very many years. So the severity of the sanctions on Cuba are great, even at times when Cuba is actually behaving in a way that the United States would like it to, in some respects, in terms of liberalizing its economic system, for example, and allowing greater private enterprise. So there is an interesting paradox and an anomaly around this policy, which I think this paper tries to address in some ways. Now, to go back to the starting point of the paper, it is that this curious paradox that the policy towards Cuba is considered to be a failure, not just by politicians, but by academics. So, for example, Margaret Doxey wrote in 1975 that the effectiveness of the Cuban embargo has been apparent for very many years. Donna Rich Kalpovitz entitled an entire book in 1998, which was called The Anatomy of a Failed Embargo. The very distinguished historian Luis Perez Jr. in 2002 called it anachronistic and anomalous. And former diplomat Wayne Smith in 2008 said the embargo was a continuing failure. And former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright echoed this consensus, and she wrote this in 2008. We need a policy towards Cuba that is free from the political wrangling of the previous half century. The embargo may have served a purpose originally, but it has outlived its usefulness. It currently has no international support and little function except to provide a convenient justification for Havana's repressive policies. The United States has no license to dictate Cuba's future, and heavy-handed attempts to do so will only sabotage those inside Cuba who are working for democracy and human rights. Now, this idea was actually cemented into presidential policy under Obama, who, defending what he said would be an irreversible, he said irreversible opening to Cuba in 2016, he said that the embargo was a failed policy, and he said at that moment, we are not seeking to impose regime change on Cuba. The embargo is outdated and should be lifted. Now, notwithstanding this determination, immediately upon succeeding him, Donald Trump began to reimpose all of the elements of the embargo that Obama had eased during his presidency. And he then went on to add even more sanctions on Cuba, and extended the extraterritoriality of the sanctions policy by bringing in aspects of legislation that had been passed earlier that would punish foreign entities for investing in Cuba. And then since taking office, Joe Biden has continued those policies. And after the disturbances in Cuba on the 11th of July this year, has added more sanctions on Cuba than existed before. So what this shows, I think, is the absolute durability of this policy. And this is absolutely contradictory to the idea that it's a failure. Why would the United States continue to do something if it is failing? And what I argue in this paper is that the idea that it's a failure is only valid if you take as a given that the goal of the policy is to bring down the communist regime and replace it with another. In that respect, it's obviously failed because the regime is still there. And therefore, what the paper seeks to show is that there is a very different reading of the policy possible, that the embargo is not, nor has it ever been, the only policy or means that has been employed against Cuba. And it's also the case that the policy aimed at changing the regime has never been actually the consistent aim of the policy. So while the embargo may have failed to bring about the overthrow or the toppling of the communist system in Cuba, it isn't necessarily actually to blame completely for that failure, because other policies have been tried as well, and they've also failed. And it can also be argued that the policy can be seen as being actually remarkably successful in meeting other policy goals, which are very often overlooked. And that's the point. So this comes from looking at some of the literature around sanctions policies and what sanctions policies actually do and what they're intended to do. So David Baldwin, in his book, Economic Statecraft, 1985, said there was a tendency at that time even amongst those who are against the embargo policy towards Cuba to confuse the means with the ends of US policy. It's clear now, for example, that since the legislation of the 1990s, the so-called Torricelli Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which were steps taken by Congress to kind of cement the economic sanctions on Cuba in legislation, they do state that the intention of the United States is to replace the Cuban government. And that is the policy that has been adopted, was adopted again by, or reiterated by the Trump administration. But that particular end has never actually been the intention entirely of successive presidents. And there have been 13 presidencies since the first sanctions were applied. So if we look at the objectives, first of all, or the ends of American policy, there is a periodization that can be drawn as to what the intended outcome of American policy towards Cuba was at different times. So very shortly after the overthrow of the Batista dictatorship by the revolution in 1959, the United States began to plan the overthrow of the Castro government, or the Castro-led government. And they employed various means to carry that out. So they did apply some sanctions, but the sanctions were part of a whole range of other policies that were enacted that were intended to soften up the regime for what would ultimately be an invasion. The invasion was tried at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and when that failed, they moved to actually trying to assassinate the leadership, they carried out an enormous amount of other subversive activities, including terrorism and sabotage attacks on Cuba. And that policy was being carried out right up until the missile crisis of 1962. Once the missile crisis was resolved and it became apparent that Cuba was going to be defended by the Soviet Union, the United States accepted that it would no longer be able to invade the country. They didn't stop trying to assassinate the leadership, and they didn't stop trying to subvert the country, but they did apply greater sanctions on the island. And the intention of the sanctions was actually part of the containment policy, which was the Cold War policy of the United States against the whole of the Soviet bloc. So by consigning Cuba to the Soviet bloc, the United States then adopted the policy of sanctioning the country as a means to contain the revolution, both preventing its spread to other parts of the region, but also to actually try and limit its success as a socialist project. I'll come back to this in a moment. And so the actual policy wasn't about trying to overthrow and replace the regime, because the United States had more or less had to accept that that wasn't going to be possible while the Soviet Union would be supporting it. And so the policy wasn't aimed during the Cold War at overthrowing the regime for the most part. Now, that changed after the end of the Cold War. And there was, in fact, a serious debate took place within the foreign policy establishment in Washington about the necessity to actually alter US policy towards Cuba once the Soviet Union had disappeared. Because the justification that had been used for keeping it was that Cuba was a security threat to the United States and therefore was subject to sanctions. Once the security threat had been removed, once the Soviet Union had disappeared and the Cold War was ended, there was no more justification for the embargo on that basis. And that's a really interesting point, because it's at this point that the domestic lobby in favor of sanctions really begins to apply itself to getting action in Congress and working around the electoral system of the United States to actually maintain the sanctions policies and actually make them greater and more severe. So the argument became one of not containing a security threat, but to actually beginning to use the sanctions policy as a way of trying to induce some kind of regime change. And so the ends of US policy became once again focused upon the idea of replacing the Cuban regime. And then the sanctions were used as a way of trying to engender opposition within the island to the Cuban government. And it's in that respect that the policy has failed, because it does have the effect of actually increasing a significant section of the Cuban population's resolve not to give in. So this idea of never surrendering to the pressure of the United States becomes greater and greater within a significant section of the population, and therefore it becomes much more solid in its support for the government rather than the opposite. Now, it's that acknowledgement that's in Madeleine Albright's statement. So some sections of the US foreign policy establishment see that as being a counterproductive policy. And what is necessary is to work within the island on sections of the population and trying to grow the section of the population that would be in favor of some kind of reform process. And it's that change, if you like, in the end of the policy, from moving from overthrowing the regime to trying to induce the regime to reform, that it underpins the idea that Obama expressed. So the intention, if you like, is to induce the existing regime to reform itself rather than overthrow it and replace it with another one. Now, once Obama left office, the very hard line, again, Cuba lobby was able to exert its influence once more in Washington through the Trump presidency, and return to this idea of trying to squeeze the Cuban regime to the point that it would collapse in some way. And we get a return to this idea of the focus on overthrowing the regime. So you can see there's a periodization of the way in which the United States has dealt with Cuba in terms of ends and means. So just to kind of provide some evidential material here, if we look at some of the available evidence, this is actually the original plan that was behind the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was started in 1960. And this was the kind of strategy that the CIA were instructed to employ. So the policy was to overthrow the regime and to use these methods in order to do so. So one thing would be to create a unified opposition towards Cuba, towards the regime in Cuba outside of the island, that would be willing to replace the regime in the island once it was removed. So in other words, creating an alternative government outside of Cuba. And then to actually create a propaganda machine, an ideological apparatus to influence the media, which would create a justification or a pretext for overthrowing the Castro regime. In other words, to demonize the Castro regime in the eyes of the world so that it would be justified to do it. And this would be outside and inside the island. So inside the island, in order to engender opposition to the regime, so you would have a domestic opposition, but outside of the island to justify the overthrow of the regime. And then, of course, to supply an underground opposition within the island, to actually finance and supply opposition movements within the island, to subvert from within. And then the creation of a force outside the island that would invade. And then in the name of that invasion force and that attempt to overthrow the government, the United States would intervene and invade itself and replace the government. That was the original plan. So sanctions were a part of this as a part of the process of weakening the country and the economy. but the main apparatus also included lots of other means. Now, contrast that with what happened after the missile crisis in 1964. So this is the Secretary of State, George Ball, writing in 1964 about what the purpose of the sanctions policy on Cuba was at that time. Sorry, I've got an aeroplane passing over, or a helicopter passing over my house. So these are the 4 points. Now, it's interesting to note that overthrowing the regime in Cuba is not one of them. So the first point about the embargo is to reduce the will and ability of the present Cuban regime to export revolution. So in other words, it's actually to limit the capacity of the existing government in Cuba to influence other governments, not to overthrow the government in Cuba. It's to demonstrate to the Cuban people that the regime is not in their favor. In other words, to make life hard for the Cuban people, but not actually induce them to overthrow it. There is an implicit acceptance that overthrowing the regime is not possible, but they can make life hard for Cubans. And to demonstrate to the peoples of the American republics that communism has no future in the hemisphere. So in other words, it's really about demonstrating to others what happens if you do what Cuba has done. In other words, it's to prevent the spread of Cuba to other countries. And finally, which is very important, it's part of the overall strategy of trying to weaken the Soviet Union itself. In other words, to make it expensive for the Soviet Union. In other words, if we freeze Cuba out of all other markets, the only market it will have will be the Soviet one. And the Soviet Union will therefore have to spend an enormous amount of energy and resources supporting Cuba. And that will drain it of strength. And those are the main objectives of the policy. Now, this brings me to this work by Daoudi and Dajani in 1983, which talks about this idea that sanctions are very often considered to be failures because they don't bring about the overthrow of regimes. But that, and this creates a fallacy. It's a fallacy that, you know, obviously sanctions policies are introduced, they say, mainly as a substitute for the fact that overthrowing the government by military means has not been possible. So they are a kind of substitute for war and invasion when war and invasion are not possible. And that means that their objective very often is seen as being the same as overthrowing the government by force. But of course, sanctions policies are very blunt instruments in that respect, and they very often do not succeed in that. But they've been therefore applied as a substitute, and therefore they have other reasons for being there than actually bringing about the end of a regime that is disliked by the sanctioner. So there are peripheral reasons, if you like, that are on the outside of the target, not in the bull's eye at the center of the target. And you can see those on the right-hand side. They talk about symbolic reasons, causing economic inconvenience to the sanctioned country, causing severe economic deprivation to the population in the hope that it might induce some kind of change. And there are other forces as well, in order to bring about some kind of satisfaction for the frustration of not being able to do things. Incidentally, of course, they do take into account the fact that these policies very often have countervailing results that, as in the case of Cuba, and I'm sure in the case of Iran, nationalism and nationalist responses are provoked, which increases the determination of governments that are subjected to sanctions to actually persist. The resolve is increased rather than diminished by the actions. And there is sympathy and empathy from governments that do not share the sanctioners' political desires, and they tend to form counterbalancing, if not alliances, methods of support to the sanctioned countries, which countervail the sanctions policies. So sanctions policies tend not to work because they produce counterproductive responses. The reason why they persist, therefore, is for reasons that have got to do with the way the sanctioner feels rather than anything else. Dard and Dajani list a number of purposes that they identify that the sanctions fulfill. Now, in my view, it's the case that the Cuban embargo policy fits very well this scheme. So if you take the first point, maintaining the perception that the sanctioner is inflicting damage to the target, that actually, is absolutely true in the case of Cuba, that the United States does actually inflict damage on the target with its embargo policy. It has severely affected Cuba. It does create hardship and shortages for the Cuban population. And even during the pandemic, the Cuban government has said that the embargo has been hampering its response to dealing with the COVID pandemic because it limits its ability to buy medicines and medical equipment and so forth. Now, it expresses a sense of moral purpose and injustice on the part of the sanctioner. Now, that may seem to be contradictory in the case of Cuba because the embargo is very often seen as being immoral because it inflicts hardship on children and innocent people and so forth in the island. And that's why many people in the international community oppose it. But in actual fact, within the United States, especially amongst the population of immigrants that lost property in Cuba, they see a moral purpose in the embargo because they feel as though their property has been stolen from them by the Cuban government. And they want retaliation for the nationalizations. And there is significant methodology for restitution and compensation within the United States embargo policy as it stands. So serving this lobby of opinion is very much a part of the embargo policy and is one of the reasons why it's persisted, because this lobby is very much in favor of getting some kind of retribution for the wrongs they felt that they have suffered as a consequence. Signifying disapproval and displeasure, well, that is in George Ball's list of reasons for the embargo in 1964. And it's an abiding determination of successive United States presidents to express a distaste for communism and the displeasure of having a communist regime within its hemisphere. And there is an interesting aside to this as well, which is this case that because the United States increased the severity of the embargo during the 1990s to create very great hardship in Cuba, there was, in actual fact, a concerted attempt by US allies in Europe in particular, but as this is being hosted, I think, through Carleton University, Canada as well, and of course, Mexico, both neighbors of the United States, and other countries in the region that were concerned about the possibility that there would be a humanitarian catastrophe in Cuba in the early 1990s, there was a concerted effort by countries, and Britain amongst them as well, to actually help Cuba overcome the difficulties it was in, caused by the embargo. Now, the policy of making the embargo tougher in the 90s, in particular the Helms-Burton law, was aimed actually at third countries, not Cuba. The embargo was extraterritorialized because it was evident that other countries were supporting Cuba. So the reach of the embargo was extended to other countries. And the idea of expressing US displeasure, not just to Cuba, but also to its allies, is a key part in understanding why the embargo was extended and increased. Now, the next one, satisfying the emotional needs of the sanctioner, I think this is a very often overlooked and underestimated reason for the embargo. The United States is a hegemon, and it's a superpower that did suffer humiliation at the hands of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And it's had a tremendous emotional debt to pay to those that it was training and promising great things to during that episode. That they trained up immigrants from Cuba to actually invade and retake their own island, in inverted commas, and then that failed, and they were captured, and they were had to be rescued by the United States. And once the United States did that, they were indebted to them in a very emotional way. And this, of course, gave the immigrants, the Cuban immigrants, a privileged status within the United States, which goes in a long way to explain why they have such great influence in Washington now. So there are significant emotional reasons why the embargo is there. And then we come to maintaining a positive image and reputation. Again, the United States has to feel good about itself. The intrusion of a communist outpost in the hemisphere threatened the United States image and continues to threaten the United States image. And it's not possible for the United States to let Cuba off. And of course, that language of was used very much by Trump in saying, for example, that Obama's policy gave Cuba everything and the United States got nothing in return. This idea that the United States cannot afford to allow Cuba to be released from the embargo without losing face is very, very important, I think. And of course, there is a domestic pressure on Washington to keep the sanctions up. And that's very, very important in the case of Cuba. The Cuban American lobby has terrific amount of influence and power, particularly in Florida, which is a very key swing state, which makes it very important in terms of electoral politics, which very often means that presidents are presidential candidates have to sell themselves to this lobby in Florida, and that then ties their hands around Cuba policy when they're in office. And then, of course, the final purpose that Dawood and Dajani point out is giving some kind of sense of symbolic vengeance for being wronged. And of course, there is very little doubt that vengeance against the Castro brothers and now their successors is very much a part of the reason why the embargo was imposed in the first place, and I think explains to some extent why it remains. Now, Dowd and Dejani point out there are three real key midterm objectives that, you know, beyond the bullseye of overthrowing the regime at some future date, are really key to understanding why sanctions policies are applied and used and maintained. So keeping up economic damage on the target country is very, very important. In the case of Cuba, that's indisputable. Using the target as an example to others is very, very important. You know, this is what happens to you if you do this. Noam Chomsky was asked once, you know, if he could, you know, explain what US policy towards Cuba, because it seems that American political scientists couldn't. And he said, well, that's because political scientists from the United States don't really acknowledge the true nature of it. But he said, unlike political scientists, Puerto Rican shopkeepers in the Lower East Side of New York understand US policy towards Cuba very well, because it's exactly the same policy that the mafia employed towards them, which is you've got to pay us protection money in order to keep your shop going. And if you stop paying it, we'll punish you. But not only will we come around and punish you and get the money off you, we'll burn your shop down as well, so that other shopkeepers in the area will know what happens if they do the same or try the same thing. And that's exactly what the US policy towards Cuba is. It's burning the shop down in order to demonstrate to the other countries in the region that this is what happens if you defy us. So it's a mafia kind of policy. And in that respect, of course, it restores the big boss's self-identity as being in charge, and maintains their self-image. So this has some very interesting, I think, ramifications when it comes to kind of looking at the Cuban embargo policy. It would seem to me that if you take into account all of these reasons, there is absolutely every reason to understand why it's persisted for so long and why it's likely to continue for a very long time. Because so long as the Cuban communist system remains, the United States will have a reason to keep it up. It has two very strong reasons. One is it has leverage, because it can ease off the embargo if as a reward to the Cuban regime, if it does things that it approves of, and then it can reapply the embargo, or different elements of it, different sanctions of it, at times when Cuba is perceived to be doing something that they disapprove of, or indeed if the Cuban regime might be showing signs of greater weakness, they can increase the sanctions in order to perhaps force the hoped for long-term goal of ending the regime. So I think that the embargo will remain because it has a useful purpose. It's not a policy that has actually outused its usefulness. And it will be possibly eased, but will remain in the background as a potential policy to be reapplied at any time that Washington feels it would be necessary to do so. And I think I can stop sharing there, and we can have a Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much for this illuminating discussion on on a framework that we can like understand Cuban sanction through which like more effectively and more deeply. Yeah, I asked the audience to drop their questions in the chat box if they want.
Oh yeah.
If they want me to read it, or if they want to speak themselves, they can just direct me their name so that I ask them to speak. Meanwhile, I can have my own question. I think when you were speaking about like how objectives of imposing like sanctions against Cuba has been shifted throughout time in the past decades, I could draw some parallel lines between like Iran sanctions and how different objectives could be extracted for understanding like why sanctions are still in place, and even like why Trump like withdrew from the Iran deal and like reimposed all the previous sanctions. It could be like terrorism, it could be regime change, it could be weakening the government, or like pursuing some sort of like internal dissatisfaction with the government or internal reforms. And I think one of the most important points was exactly this. Like I perceive sanctions as part of like these global economic policies or economic forces that are aimed at, for example, pursuing austerity measures or like other kind of liberalizing economy. And it was the case for Iran. Like, for example, we had severe decreasing budget in health sector or education sector, or like these are not like these two cases, like Iran and Cuba, are not exactly the same, like in terms of like what are the impact, like what are the objectives of sanctions in Washington, but the repercussions or the impacts of sanctions on the target government has been to some extent the same. Like they had to go through heavily reforming the economy, like to decrease the budget. And I guess, as I said in the beginning, it is also the case for Venezuela. Venezuela is first also pursuing like austerity to a great degree. But what my question is like,
Well,
as you mentioned, like objectives of sanctions in Washington and how it has been changed over time, how has the response of the Cuban government or like their policies in reforming the government, like reforming policies, or like, I don't know, media production or other sort of response have been changed throughout time in response to sanctions? Have there been like specific themes that we can like extract and say like during this period, the Cuban government response was more around this type of policies, and later it has shaped through, like, for example, other types?
well, yes. I mean, okay, we could talk a lot. Some of the things you said actually made me think about a number of elements. You mentioned terrorism as a justification. I think that's an interesting one, because of course Cuba was accused of being a terrorist state, and Iran is on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And Cuba has now been put back on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. I mean, in both cases, I think, you know, to a large extent, these are spurious claims. Possibly in the case of Iran, there is this area around support for Hamas in Lebanon, which gives some evidence to support that. But in the case of Cuba, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Cuba is it. The only evidence there is some support for Basque separatism in Spain, which is very spurious. So these are, this putting these countries on this list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism is a kind of pretext to make the sanctions greater when there are actual pressures, domestic pressures, being brought to bear on the government, which would be pressing for an alleviation of the sanctions. In other words, if you can accuse the state of being a terrorist state, then there is a reason to keep the sanctions on and make them harder. So the idea of terrorism is as an ideological justification is very important. I think in the case of Iran, there is an analogy to be drawn because of the pressure, the domestic pressure to keep sanctions on. But ironically, it isn't a domestic lobby which is made up entirely of Iranian emigres. In the case of Cuba, it's almost entirely Cuban emigres. But in the case of Iran, it's the Israeli lobby as well. So you have this very large Israeli lobby in the United States, which is putting pressure on the US government to maintain sanctions on Iran because they wish to support Israel. And that is a key kind of factor, I think, in that respect. Now, coming around to the response that Cuba has had, of course, there is a periodization as well in terms of Cuba's own foreign policy. So in actual fact, United States policy towards Cuba can be seen as having been rational in some respects, especially in the early 1960s, because of course Cuba did try an export revolution. It was very active in supporting guerrilla movements in other parts of Latin America. And in fact was very important in supporting anti-colonial movements globally. So in terms of trying to prevent the spread of leftist regimes within the context of the Cold War, US policy of trying to kind of remove the Cuban government was actually quite rational. Che Guevara, for example, was, killed attempting to start a revolution in Bolivia. So until the mid-60s, US policy towards Cuba was based upon a rational assessment of what Cuba was doing. It was subversive. It was a threat. Perhaps not as big a threat as they were saying it was, but it was definitely a threat. Later on, the situation changed slightly because the United States actually faced numerous actors that were challenging its hegemony. Vietnam, in Chile, Allende in the early 70s and so on. US policy was, spread in a global way, and Cuba was trying to sort of fitting within that and responding to that. And of course, it gave support to Vietnam, it gave support to Allende in Chile. So to some extent, the rationale for the sanctions policy as part of an overall strategy towards Cuba does make sense, especially to very anti-communist politicians in the United States. So that explains, I think, a great deal as to why the policy of let's not call it a sanctions policy, but let's call it animosity towards the Cuban government is persistent. Okay. And the need to eliminate it is seen as being actually by many people a kind of necessary thing. I mean, it needs to happen because it's seen as a kind of a the analogy with a disease is important. The idea of in English, the word quarantine is used medically. It's if somebody has a disease that is contagious, they are isolated from the rest of the population. They are placed in quarantine to stop them giving the disease to others. Now, in the mind of American politicians, Cuba was seen as kind of having a contagious disease, which is communism. And it needed to be isolated in order to prevent the contagion from spreading. This idea of the domino theory. That kind of way of seeing communism as a sort of a ideological germ, I think, is part and parcel of the way very many people in the United States on the right understand Cuba. That it's kind of like a disease that needs to be eliminated, or it has a disease that needs to be eliminated. And I think if you think about the language sometimes that is employed, particularly in some aspects of the policy, like, for example, the Helms-Burton Law, talks about the need to eliminate the Communist Party and to eliminate all the institutions of the Cuban state that might have vestiges of the previous regime. So there is this kind of idea of cleansing and eradicating all elements that could possibly, contain this thing. And I think that's probably also applies to Islamism in a way, or the idea of it's kind of like this idea that Islam is some kind of evil ideology that needs to be removed somehow. I think that does work, and I think that's very much psychological. And I think that could help to explain why so many people support doing mean things, if you like, to countries which, like Cuba, for example. But I think to take a kind of much more, let's say, vulgar Marxist view of it, at bottom, there is always this question of property and property relations. And countries which, it's very clear historically in the Latin American region anyway, any government that enacts policies that affect the rights and privileges enjoyed by American investors in terms of owning property within their jurisdiction are subjected to antagonistic policies by the United States. In other words, the main crime is to seek to restrict the operation of American capitalism within your borders. The United States policy is always directed to maintaining open systems that are open to American penetration by US companies and the maintenance of that open operation. The so-called open door policy, and that's a very long established American foreign policy goal, which goes back to the early 19th century. And so I think that, you know, that is an overriding consideration, which I think you'll find is very common to all of these cases, that any regime, whether they are, let's say, secular and nationalist like the Assad regime, or religious, theocratic, and as is the case with Iran, or communist, let's say, nationalist stroke communist in the case of Cuba, they will all be subjected to policies that, you know, punishment by the United States, because the one thing they all do or have done is close off or reduce American economic interests.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I have a question from one of the audience.
Yeah.
It is related to the rise of China and the possibility of a new, I mean, now the world is, I guess, entering a kind of polarized stage, and the possibility of a new global order in the following years. And the question is, do you think that this new order would reduce the impact of US imposed sanctions, or shift the kind of embargo and policies on the side of Washington? Or like, how do you perceive
this is a really good question. This is a really good question. Yeah. Can I just ask for a brief pause? I'll come back to this. I've got to go and put something in the oven for my family's dinner. Is that okay? I'll be about 5 minutes. So yeah, we can make a cup of tea and I'll come back. Is that okay?
Yes, sure. I would be happy if other people here could turn on their videos so we can see some other faces. Thank you, Esma. You're on mute.
Yeah, I was just saying, I know when you moderate and everyone's camera is off, it's like, how does that feel?
Yeah. I will call you after this question, Esma. Thank you for raising your hand.
I was like, I had some problems with the reaction section. I was like,
so that was a raised hand, right? Or was it like, I mean, did you have questions?
Yeah, it's mostly comments, so I don't have question much. But
okay.
Yeah. But I mean, if someone else has other questions, feel free to.
Yeah, definitely.
First.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a really interesting and important point. And it's really huge. We're obviously at a moment when the United States, the world order is changing. We still don't know where it's going to go. And there's a number of things that I think about, which makes me kind of unable to really see clearly or predict in any kind of secure way what could or could not happen. So there are a number of scenarios. Obviously, if you start from the point of view that China is going to become the greatest economic power on the planet within maybe 10 years. So there is this element of knowing that inevitably an increasing amount of area of the world is going to be drawn towards China. And this, of course, is extremely serious from the point of view of the United States. And how the United States manages this is what the real big question is about. Obviously, the United States has got this incredibly large military potential. It's still got a greater military power than all of the other major countries, including China, combined. So obviously, the United States is a waning economic power in some respects, although in terms of technology, and certainly in terms of the biggest IT companies, for example, if you think of Google, think of Microsoft. If you think of the big software companies, they're all American. So their dominance in, let's say, the Western world, the Western liberal democratic world, is secure. But in the Asian Pacific area, the Indo-Pacific area, I'm not too sure. So there is a kind of a bipolarity developing. And the Chinese system is different. It has a different political system, although it's adopted certain market elements. It's got this hybrid system that would point to a kind of potential for there to be maybe a geographically defined split that might develop. So you would get a bipolar arrangement whereby there would be a sphere of influence that the United States has and a sphere of influence that China has, and there would be an increasing differentiation, political and economic, between the two, and less interaction between the two. But the problem with that idea is that to get to that, the arrangements that have been created since the end of the Cold War would have to be undone. And it seems to me that the Chinese system is too integrated into the global system for that to happen. So what we've got, I think, is a potential for a great deal of instability. And you can see, I think, probably the beginnings of this instability, this turbulence, beginning to show itself in certain ways. I think the recent conflict between France and the United States and Australia over this pact is very interesting, because you've got a real division there within the liberal Western liberal world, which has never really happened before to that extent. I mean, it's quite a severe split, and you know, that tells you that if there is a division, it's going to be quite interesting. It may be that the continent, the Euro-Asian continent, will form the Chinese camp, if you like. You know, that France, the European Union, Germany will actually be pulled into some kind of closer alliance or arrangement with China and Russia than with the United States, and that Britain, the English-speaking South, New Zealand, Australia, the Western Hemisphere, and possibly some parts of Southeast Asia, maybe India, could be drawn into a separate global division. That could be the split. It could be a kind of a global maritime versus terrestrial Eurasian division of the world. Now, where would Cuba fit in that? Cuba would be pretty frozen out of the Western one, and be, you know, I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know what the answer is, but it's a really good question to ask and think about. On the other hand, I don't think it's beyond the bounds of possibility that we will see a major recession, a global depression of a huge scale, which will be obviously affect China, but will probably be much more destabilizing in the Western liberal system, to the Western liberal, as in the past. The vulnerability of the Western liberal model to create huge social problems that create very major domestic crises, political crises, I think is much more likely than in China. I think the Chinese system will survive a downturn much better than the Western model, and of course the affordability then of very large overextensions of military power by the United States will become much less feasible. The United States may have to withdraw even more, and it could be an actual fact that the United States will suffer a major problem in the not too distant future as a consequence of the effects of the pandemic. Certainly the situation in Britain, where I'm sitting right now, doesn't look great economically. I mean, Britain is extremely exposed at the moment, and is looking at going into the winter with very, very severe economic problems that I should think will create massive social problems. I can foresee a big political crisis developing in Britain this winter.
Yeah, I understand that. going to be a global, multi-layered global crisis that happen almost in every country and every region of the world, though at a different
I mean, I think
level.
one thing to look carefully at, I think, is this property company in China, which is in the process of. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the consequences of the collapse of that company is being felt more in Hong Kong and Western European markets than it is in China. That there is a great deal of exposure, investment exposure by Western banks, and particularly those that are based in Hong Kong, in this company. Now, effectively, that means that the Chinese government, if it rescues this company, will be actually rescuing significant Western investors as well. So this means that the Chinese economy is too integrated in the Western economy for there to be a real bipolarity ever emerging. So this is part of the reasons why I can't make my mind up what's going to happen, because it seems to me that unlike the previous bipolar system, the Cold War, the socialist camp, the Comecon countries, were to a very great extent cut off from the Western liberal system. They had a completely separate economic system. The Chinese system is too integrated into the Western system for that kind of division to take place. There can't really be a Cold War of the same kind as existed before, because the two systems are too economically integrated. So, that's why I can't really understand or make my mind up what might happen.
Yeah, true. Actually, it is a bit off topic, but what comes to my mind when I think about this picture in future is like sanctions programs on China itself, which is going to be imposed in the near future by the OFAC. So I'm like curious to see how that would affect, like how that would come to the picture, global picture, and how that would impact like both American companies and corporations and Chinese and like the
well, see,
economy.
I mean, I think that there are sanctions already being applied to China, aren't there? Yeah. I mean, they don't have a great deal of effect. So again, they're kind of symbolic in many ways. But China can respond by putting sanctions of its own on the West. So unlike, countries like, Iran and so on, that don't have leverage, China has leverage. And of course, China has got enormous reserves of American currency. And the problem for the United States is liquidity, that the Chinese could sell their holdings of US dollars, which would devalue the US dollar very quickly overnight. I mean, China has significant leverage against the United States. So whatever sanctions the United States places on China could result in them actually creating a huge problem for themselves. So again, I don't see how that's going to work unless it's purely symbolic. Now, of course, we are in the age of fake news and, this realm of virtual reality. And yes, I can see a kind of virtual sanctions regime being imposed, but in reality, it not actually affecting things very much. And I mean, we've got this case at the moment of, it's very difficult to change things, to turn things around once you've developed certain relationships. So if you take the case of, let's say, Apple. So, you know, I mean, Apple, of course, there's an awful lot of the software and knowledge element of the Apple iPhone that is kept in the United States, but in significant amount of the capital investment in the production process is invested in China. I mean, they've built factories there and they've got a trained workforce to make certain elements of the phone. Now, to move that production from China to another site can't be done overnight. So in order to continue the production of the iPhone, a sanction can't be placed on China that would affect that value chain, because you would be actually sanctioning your own company. So whatever sanctions or whatever move towards some kind of bipolarity is going to take a long time. It can't happen overnight. I mean, if it were to happen overnight, there would be severe dislocation in the United States. You know, people wouldn't be able to get the stuff they want because there's too much integration. So again, I can't see this happening quickly, if at all, because in the end, certain things are, you know, more efficient and better done the way they are. I'm very dubious. I'm very dubious. I think a lot of it is rhetorical, in fact. But we'll see. Somebody's got their hand up. Asma's got their hand up.
Yes, Asma, please.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk, and for a lot of interesting things that came up in Q&A. I had like some previous comments on the presentation, but with the last conversation on China and America, and this these talks about the future bipolar world, which might not be very such a distant future anymore. So I can't help not thinking about how that gonna help, how the rise of China and the bipolar future are gonna change the whole sanction landscape itself, you know, because I think after the Cold War, we see how economic sanctions has more increasingly was used, and to some extent became replaced by the use of military conflict. It became an effective tool of coercion, and because of maybe a lot of changes in the wider global political economy atmosphere, the globalization and other reasons.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, you see, I think I can't escape from this logic. Okay, this is logic. It's a logical argument. It's not based in empirical evidence. It's basically a logical argument. Okay, so my view is that the kind of neoliberal model, which says the free market is best, is actually doomed to failure. That the free markets will lead to economic catastrophe sooner or later. Yeah. And it is inevitable that state intervention has to take place in order to save the system. And that's the historical lesson anyway. So of the two systems, the Chinese one is going to win, because it is a mixed model in which the state maintains an enormous amount of control over the economic system, and is strong enough actor to be able to intervene in the system to put right what goes wrong when the market goes wrong. So of the two systems, the Chinese one is stronger and will outlast any problems, in my view. Okay, that's my logical argument. But the logic of the argument is this, is that when the Western liberal model gets into trouble, it will have to revert to state intervention. In other words, it will have to become more like the Chinese model in order to survive. So there will be a convergence. I think that the overarching ecological crisis, which is of course a global crisis, will work to produce that convergence. In other words, the Western liberal model will have to become more state interventionist in order to deal with the ecological problems that we're facing. And that will make it more likely to wish to work with China than against it. And I think that the Chinese leadership is far-sighted enough to understand that it will avoid confrontation and conflict with the West and wait for the West to have to change and come to the table and discuss things with it. I mean, that's my logical argument. Okay, I may be completely mad, I may be wrong, but that's the way I see it. Okay.
And also, I think it's the most optimistic picture.
Well, I mean, of course, things can go badly wrong, but I'm very much, if you haven't read Karl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, I think that's essential to read, because he makes a very cogent and logical argument about why the free market system will fail and always will fail and will have to be corrected. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that what happens is positive, because in Western Europe, the collapse of the Western liberal model produced Nazism, and maybe some kind of Nazism will, some kind of evil force may take over in the West, which would mean that maybe China would have to rescue us from it, you know. But it would seem to me that the West has got too many enemies that, you know, I mean, take Iran, for example, take Russia, for example. These areas will actually join China. They will form alliances with China against the West. And I can't see how the West can win. I don't see how it can win. And I think in order to save itself, it will have to reform. I don't think it can be aggressive. I mean, even if you think about it, well, I mean, there are some strategic minerals, for example, that these rare metals, these rare earth metals that at the moment China has a monopoly in. I think it's completely contradictory to think that you can't make this technology without these rare earth metals, and the only people mining them at the moment are the Chinese. So the Chinese have a strategic, you know, commodity hold over the West. They could just stop selling the West these commodities. which would cause severe problems for them. I don't see the West being able to actually prevent the rise of China, and it's a big problem for them. Incidentally, there was a very interesting interchange in the 90s when a man called Richard Nuccio was the Undersecretary of State in the United States, in charge of Western Hemisphere affairs under Bill Clinton. And at that time, Clinton had, this very contradictory policy of making China a favored nation in terms of trade, and making Vietnam a favored nation, but was maintaining the embargo on Cuba. And Nuccio was asked, why are you keeping the sanctions on Cuba and you're lifting them on China? Why are you engaged? And he said, well, the truth of the matter is that China is too big. We can't do anything to China, so we've got to work with it. Whereas Cuba is a small country, and we can punish Cuba, so we will. And he lost his jobs. Clinton sacked him because he was too honest. He basically said the thing. He said, we've got nothing against Chinese communism because China is just too big. We can't invade it. We can't overthrow it. We can't deal with it. Cuba is possible, so we will. And I think that's still the case. I mean, that was back in the 90s. I mean, look at China now. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, let's say you add up the total number of people in the European Union and the total number of people in the United States and Canada, you still don't have as many people as there are in China. I mean, it's 1.4 billion people. I mean, it's just completely incomprehensible that you could possibly fight a war against China, even a limited war against China. I don't think it's possible. And of course, during the Cold War, the United States was way more powerful than the Soviet Union in actual reality, economically, technologically, militarily. In truth, the United States was way, way beyond the capability of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. But that's not the case with China. Economically, China is far, far more powerful in relation to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was. So any kind of Cold War with China, I don't think it's really feasible. And I think the people that are talking about it are, I think a lot of it is just rhetoric, and I think it's scaremongering, and I think ideologically it's really more ideological than real. I can't see it possibly truly happening. You'll have to excuse me for a moment. Again, I'm going to go and turn it round.
Okay, Reza, I'm going to ask you for the last comment, and then we'll close it. Thank you,
Yes.
Esma, for your contribution.
Sure.
Yeah, I also dropped some links that just came to my mind around the topics that we touched upon. So if anyone was interested whether they are good read.
Interestingly, I think also what was interesting was, in fact, Iran yesterday basically said to the British, go away. You know, I mean, the power of Britain at the moment is so low, and its influence in the world is so low. It's miserably low. You know, you know, I think the West is, well, I think it's actually very weak, and a lot of this is posturing. I really do. Anyway, I may be wrong.
Thank you. And Reza is going to ask, I don't know, Merky's comments, and I think we should close this soon because maybe that is. It has been.
It's been great actually talking to you, and
yeah.
you know, I hope it's helpful anyway.
Thank you. Reza, are you there?
Yes, yes. I just want to ask you about the economics of Cuba. Do you think the kind of liberal market will go through Cuba, and neoliberalism will go there in a like totally magnificent level, or no, it's just Cuba will resist on this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that first of all, I think that the hegemony in the true Gramscian sense of capitalism is broken in Cuba. There is far too many people who are socialist in Cuba. The vast majority of people in Cuba are socialists, and they understand very well the nature of capitalism. And so the idea of Cuba becoming capitalist is very, very far in the distant future. There's too much. There's too many people who are ideologically committed to socialism there for you know, that to occur. And the kind of system that is developed in Cuba is a hybrid along the Chinese stroke Vietnamese model. You know, a limited amount of private enterprise being permitted in the production and distribution of goods and services for consumption by the population, a opening to foreign investment and foreign investors under extremely controlled conditions, which involve a close relationship with state-owned enterprises, control of the banking system by the state, and still very large state-owned corporations with very large involvement in the domestic economy. So that kind of hybrid model is what is being developed in Cuba. It does acknowledge private ownership of property by its own citizens and a certain level of small and medium-sized private enterprise. But it doesn't represent a change towards capitalism. It's an adaptation of socialism. Some people have likened it very much to Lenin's new economic model, and as they have the Chinese system under Deng. But yeah, it's not neoliberal or liberal capitalism as at all. And you know, I don't think it's ever likely that would happen in Cuba with, you know, with the current government, or, you know, with the support of the population. It could only ever be imposed upon Cuba by some kind of force, I think. So I don't think a neoliberal solution will happen in Cuba. No, not at all. So yeah, that will present a problem. It will always present a problem and a challenge to the United States in that regard. You know, unless the United States undergoes some kind of transformation, which may happen, you know, it's probably more likely to happen in the United States in some ways than it is in Cuba, to tell you the truth, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll hope for that and wait to see that. Okay, thank you all for this very interesting and very illuminating discussion about Cuba and the world order in near future. I hope to see you all in the next discussions. And again, thank you, Dr. Wilkinson, for your time and for your
best of luck, all of you, with your PhDs. I really hope you are all very successful. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you all. Have a great night and day wherever you are. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's been lovely. Bye-bye.
Bye.